There once lived a merchant named Marcel. He was a widower, and all his hopes for rebuilding the life he envisioned for his 6 children rested upon a fleet of ships into which he had poured his entire fortune. Storms, mischance, and the long arm of fate do not always respect our careful plans. One by one, those ships were swallowed by distance and silence until there was nothing left to wait for. Marcel had no wife to whom he needed to bring this grim news. His beloved had passed away years earlier, but he did have 6 children who had grown up with the comforts of privilege and the expectations that comfort often brings. When word spread through town that the merchant's fortune had failed and that creditors wanted their payments with a sternness that allowed no compromise whatsoever, the family's life changed with startling speed. Weeks turned to months, and still no sails appeared in the harbor. Piece by piece, the things that had once surrounded them disappeared. The grand dining table went first, then the tall mirror framed in carved wood, then the carriage that had taken them to festivals, and at last the jewels and fine gowns that had seemed part of the daughters' very identities. Finally, the large house with its polished stair rails and its polished reputation had to be given up as well, and the family moved to a small cottage set at the edge of town where the roofs are lower and the streets grow quiet as soon as evening comes. Marcel traveled often because he had to. He met contacts, called on former business partners, and looked for anyone who might extend a hand so he could begin anew. While he was away, the children were left to keep the household going on their own. They were old enough for responsibility. Their ages placed them directly on the border between youth and adulthood. Yet knowledge gained in drawing rooms and gardens is not the same as knowledge earned by tending fires and washing floors, and the 3 sons and the 2 eldest daughters proved nearly powerless when the moment came to act. They were clever, yes, and full of opinions certainly, but as for the practical chores that keep a home standing, those skills they simply did not possess. The youngest child, however, was different. Her name was Elodie. Perhaps it was because she stood at that youthful age when the heart remains impressionable and hope clings with both hands. Or perhaps it was because her nature was truly gentle, steadfast, and quietly bright. Whatever the reason, Elodie stepped toward work rather than away from it. She tied on an apron, asked questions, and listened carefully to the answers. She learned how to mix dough with hands that warmed it into rising. She learned to mend seams with stitches so even that the seams looked better than before. She taught herself the rhythm of watering a garden, not too much and not too little, and how to gather eggs without startling the hens. At first, the villagers watched with reserve. They knew who this family had been, and they were accustomed to former nobles who came to the edge of town and acted as if the world owed them favor. But Elodie greeted each person with a respectful kindness that did not feel forced. She stood in doorways and asked for advice with honesty that contained no pride. She practiced what she learned, brought loaves to neighbors as thanks, and laughed with the children who played in the lanes. Slowly, suspicion turned into approval, and approval, day by day, turned into genuine affection. Elodie became, without any announcement at all, the thread that held the family together when it might otherwise have come apart. In contrast, her brothers and older sisters resisted the change with every fiber of their being. They wore their discontent like heavy cloaks and complained with an intensity that left them exhausted. They did not attempt to win favor with the people who lived beside them. They did not try to master even simple tasks. They waited for fortune to reverse itself while Elodie quietly kept the hearth burning, swept the stone floor, and made sure there was soup in the pot when their father returned from yet another long search for hope. 2 years of such living went by. 2 years of early mornings and modest meals. 2 years of learning that a carefully tended garden can reward a family better than a warehouse full of promises. Then, on a morning that began like any other, a messenger knocked at the cottage door and brought astonishing news. One of Marcel's lost ships had been seen in the harbor, and what was more, its cargo was said to be largely intact. The older children shouted with triumph. They proclaimed that at last their life among villagers was over, and they began to imagine, with great detail and great eagerness, all the ornaments and entertainments that would return to them. Elodie smiled for their sake. She truly did, but inside she felt something tender and complicated. In the simple cottage with its swept floor and well-scrubbed table, she had discovered a kind of contentment she had not known before. The scent of bread baking in the low oven, the neatness of a garden path she had laid with her own hands, the sense of being useful every single day, these had become treasures to her in a way jeweled clasps had never been. She wanted her family to be relieved of worry. She wanted them to feel secure again. Yet she was not certain she wanted to return to that distant, idle life where the hours were dressed in silk but emptied of purpose. To claim what might remain of his property, Marcel would have to travel to the port by horse. He expected to be gone a few days. Once his affairs were put in order, he planned to hire a comfortable coach for the journey back. Before he left, in a spirit both hopeful and fatherly, he asked each of his children to tell him what gift they wished him to bring. The elder siblings seized the opportunity at once. One of the sons wanted a finely cut coat with silvered buttons that would catch the light. Another asked for boots made of soft leather and a hat trimmed elaborately. The daughters requested ribbons that would cascade like waterfalls and capes lined with velvet. And there was talk of furs and jewels that would declare to everyone that the family's fortunes had been restored completely. Only Elodie remained quiet. When her father noticed and urged her gently to speak, she answered in a voice that carried both shyness and sincerity. "Father, there is something I have longed to see with my own eyes since I was little. In this region it does not grow, and it has always seemed to me both rare and precious. If you can find it, and if it does not bring you trouble to do so, would you bring me a single rose, in whatever color you happen to find?" Marcel chuckled, fondness warming his features at this curious request, and agreed at once. In his thoughts, he resolved to add a small necklace or delicate trinket as well, because he felt a fatherly joy at the idea of surprising his youngest child. When the morning of departure arrived, the weather was fair. Elodie, careful as always, packed his saddlebags with bread, cheese, apples, and a small jar of honey she had traded for with a neighbor. She adjusted the strap so it would not chafe the horse and wished her father a heartfelt farewell. There was a shimmer of tears in her eyes, not of fear but of tenderness. The others waved without much attention. They were already discussing fabrics and jewelers. Marcel guided his horse onto the forest road, where sunlight slipped between the leaves and painted the path with patches of brightness and shade. Elodie stood at the gate and watched until the last glimmer of his coat vanished among the trees. A quiet unease lingered in her chest, like a cloud that would not quite dissolve, but she said nothing. Had not good fortune finally returned? Marcel rode with urgency, his mind full of plans that unfolded one after another. The ship would provide the seed for a renewed business, he told himself. He would be careful this time and deliberate. He would build slowly and wisely. He imagined the crates opening and the scent of spices rising. Imagined the sheen of silk sliding over careful fingers. Imagined his name spoken with respect once more by those who had doubted him. All the while, the horse carried him forward to the city by the sea. But reality can be as quick and unforgiving as a storm over open water. When Marcel reached the port, his hopes were crushed with a thoroughness that left him shaken. It was true, the ship had come back and most of its cargo had survived the voyage. It was also true that news travels very fast indeed when money is involved. Marcel's creditors had acted swiftly, decisively, and with absolutely no hesitation whatsoever. By the time he arrived, the entire cargo had been seized and divided to settle the debts recorded against his name. He spent the day going from one merchant to another, explaining, negotiating, pleading for time. He asked for extensions with humility, presented ideas for repayment with careful logic, and even appealed to old friendships he had thought would matter. None of it helped in the least. At sunset he possessed no debts, yes, but he also possessed no coin, no shares of cargo, no promise he could bring home like a flame held safe in a lantern. There was not even enough left to purchase a simple present for his children. No silk shoes, no bright buckles, not even the smallest ribbon. The rose that Elodie had wished for so tenderly seemed far away as well. Disheartened more than he had been in years, Marcel could not bear to remain in the city overnight. Without making sensible preparations for the road, without writing ahead to his children, and without truly considering the weather that had begun to change, he mounted his tired horse and turned back toward home. Dusk gave way to darkness. The clouds thickened, the wind found its voice, and then the storm arrived for real. Rain hurled itself at the earth. Thunder cracked in a way that felt almost personal. Lightning stitched jagged patterns across the sky. Startled, the horse shied from a broken limb in the road and bolted into the trees, away from the path Marcel knew. Branches struck against his coat. The undergrowth clutched at the horse's legs. The night became a swirling thing of rain and noise, and Marcel realized, with a sinking clarity, that he had made a foolish decision in choosing to ride out instead of waiting for morning. He pulled on the reins and spoke to the horse in a tone that he hoped sounded calm. They pushed through a tangle of dark trunks and dripping leaves, searching for any kind of shelter. Some rocky overhang, some hollow, anything at all that would keep them from the violence of the wind. After what felt like hours, a stone wall appeared ahead, looming out of the rain. Marcel slowed, following its length until he reached a tall iron gate that stood slightly ajar, as if a large hand had pulled it half open and then forgotten to close it. He slid from the saddle, pushed the heavy gate wide enough for the horse, and stepped through. Inside, a paved path, made bright and slick by rain, ran into the depths of a large estate. He led the horse along it, passing through clusters of trees that shook and whispered under the storm's command. At last a building came into view, a house so vast that even in the stuttering light it felt imposing. Tall windows rose like solemn eyes. A long front with identical wings on both sides stretched into the darkness, and above, a steep roof bristled with chimneys. Marcel's exhaustion and common sense argued together, and need one. He guided the horse into a sheltered alcove off the main steps, tied the reins securely, and clapped the horse's shoulder in thanks. Then he climbed to the door, a door that must have taken several strong people to hang when the house was new. He lifted the iron knocker and let it fall. The sound rolled off into the hallways beyond, or so he imagined, and for a moment it even seemed to answer the thunder as if the house itself were aware of his presence. No footsteps approached. No candlelight bobbed in a welcoming way. Marcel waited, shivering. When no reply came, he pressed his shoulder against the door and pushed. Yielded. He stumbled forward into a grand entry, caught himself, and stood very still while the echoes of his arrival faded. The interior was large and formal, but there was a hush upon it, a hush that felt not only empty but ancient. Curved staircases arched upward on both sides like the wings of some great bird folded in repose. Suits of armor stood in several alcoves, their helmets turned toward the center as if they had been placed to watch those who came and went. Directly opposite, a pair of beautifully carved double doors showed the faintest suggestion of light along the crack where they met. Marcel called out, just a brief greeting that stated his need for shelter, spoken with as much respect as a weary man could command. His voice was swallowed by the stillness. He cleared his throat, smoothed the water from his hair, and walked toward the doors. He pushed them open and leaned into a room that immediately felt warmer, more human, than the hall. A fire blazed in an immense hearth, and in front of it stood a table laid for a single person. A loaf of bread with a neat heel cut away, roasted meat that shone with its own juices, a small plate of late summer fruit, a carafe, and a large glass that caught and reflected the firelight like a small pool. The rest of the room revealed upholstered chairs softened by long use, and books stacked upon side tables as if someone had been reading in several places at once and set the volumes down carelessly. There was no sign of a host. Marcel waited, feeling the heat of the fire lift the chill from his bones. He told himself he would explain everything when the owner returned. The storm, the dangerous road, the fear for his horse. But hunger has its own logic, and the smell of the food made him ache. He began with a single slice of bread. Nothing more, he promised himself, and then took another and then another. The roasted meat was tender, the fruit bright, the drink in the glass surprisingly refreshing. Minutes slid by and still no one appeared. At last he allowed himself to sit fully at the table and finish the meal that had been waiting there. He ate slowly as a respectful guest would, but he ate it all the same. Afterward he leaned back, satisfaction and gratitude loosening his tired body. He lifted the carafe and poured the last of its contents into the glass, thinking again of the letter in his pocket, the letter that had once signified hope and now felt like a cruel trick. He placed that letter on the table and pushed it away as if distance could lessen its sting. The fire danced and murmured, and the chair supported him with the kind of comfort that suggests years of use by someone who loved this room. Without intending it in the least, Marcel's eyes drifted closed and he fell into a deep sleep without dreams. When morning arrived, he woke with a moment of confusion, as we all do sometimes in an unfamiliar place. The fire had burned to ashes long ago. The dishes and glass from his meal remained visible on the table exactly as he had left them, without the slightest sign that anyone had entered during the night. The air of the room contained that same curious hush. Shame began to prickle. He had, after all, entered a stranger's home without permission, eaten a stranger's food without asking, and fallen asleep by a stranger's fire. Embarrassment, polite, insistent, and impossible to argue with, told him to leave quickly and quietly before the owner returned and found him there. He rose, adjusted his coat, and walked back through the carved doors into the entry hall. In the gray light of morning, he could see more clearly than he had the night before. The runners that flowed down the twin staircases were faded and dusty, threaded with neglect. The suits of armor wore a film upon them as if no hand had polished them in years. The silence was not merely the everyday silence of a house whose master was away. It was the deeper absence that settles when life has been missing for a long time. Marcel crossed the flagstones on light feet, as if sound itself could summon watchful eyes from nowhere. He reached the front door, placed both hands on the handles and pulled. The heavy door resisted, then sighed open as if exhaling a story it had been holding all night. He slipped through the gap into a mist-filled courtyard and eased the door shut behind him until the latch settled. He straightened his waistcoat, an instinctive gesture, an attempt to recover dignity, and told himself he would do his best to forget this strange detour entirely. He hurried to the alcove where his horse had been tied. She lifted her head at the sound of his step, ears flicking forward. Relieved, he reached into the saddlebag and found one apple Elodie had tucked there for him. He split it and fed it to the horse in 2 generous pieces, rubbing the soft stretch of her nose as she chewed. Then he untied the reins, turned her carefully, and led her back along the stone path that wound through the grounds toward the gate through which they had entered. The storm had passed, but beads of water still clung to leaves and iron and stone, glittering like a million small promises that would vanish once the sun rose higher. When he reached the gate, instinct made him look back. In the new light, the house, the chateau, stood in clear detail. It was long and rectangular, built of pale stone that had weathered toward a quiet beige. A central block formed the heart, with identical wings stretching to either side with such symmetry that it created an impression of order bordering on sternness. The windows were tall and narrow, stacked in a formal rhythm across 2 large floors. They looked down as if they were watchful, as if they had once observed lively arrivals and now observed departures that were far more subdued. The tiled roof sloped steeply and was crowded with chimneys, so many that they resembled a small forest of brick and stone. Marcel felt a ripple of unease break across his skin. He could not say why. Perhaps it was the strangeness of having found warmth and food prepared for one and yet meeting no host whatsoever. Perhaps it was the way the great house seemed at the same time abandoned and alert, neglected and yet not asleep. He tightened his grip on the reins, passed under the ironwork of the gate, and started along the road that would lead him back toward the life he knew, toward his children, toward Elodie who would listen with her whole heart, and toward whatever new trial or mercy the day would bring. As the horse's hooves clicked softly upon the stones, Marcel promised himself he would be careful with his telling. He would not alarm his family. He would not describe the house as hostile because it had sheltered him. He would not call it welcoming because it had offered no greeting. He would say only what was precisely true, that a storm had driven him from the road, that a wall had appeared, that behind a gate there had been a mansion with a hearth alight and a table set, and that in the morning he had left it as quietly as any thankful trespasser could. He would keep to facts and leave out interpretations, because sometimes interpretations trouble the mind more than the events themselves. Yet as he rode, he could not stop thinking of Elodie's request, that gentle wish for a single rose. It seemed such a small thing and yet somehow more difficult now than any embroidered cape or jeweled clasp his older children had demanded with such certainty. He had promised himself he would bring it to her if he could. He had promised her in words, and promises given to the youngest and kindest child of a household have a way of glowing in a father's memory. As the mist thinned and the morning gathered itself toward day, Marcel held that promise close, like a fragile bloom he could not yet see but could already feel, as real as the breath that warmed the air between him and the horse who carried him steadily onward. He glanced once more over his shoulder. The chateau was almost lost behind the trees now, only that dense forest of chimneys still visible above the green. He whispered something that was not quite a farewell and not quite a prayer, something simple and honest, and then faced the road ahead, letting the rhythm of the ride steady him. Whatever waited for him next, explanations, disappointments, or the quiet relief of home, he would meet it, because that is what one does when day follows night and an old story takes its time unfolding, step by gentle step. Turning his back on the stern silhouette of the great house, he guided the mare toward the front gate, noticing on either side the gardens that had once been carefully designed and were now lavishly overgrown. Just before the path ended, his eye caught on a small pergola, charming despite its neglect, entirely claimed by climbing roses. In the center of a circular sitting nook, a single bush overflowed with blossoms, an astonishing profusion of vivid pink blooms more exquisite than any he had ever seen in his life. In a heartbeat, he remembered the promise he had made to Elodie. Determined to keep his word to his youngest child, Marcel reached into his bag, drew out the small knife he always carried, and set about cutting the flowers. One would not suffice, not for a pledge given with such warmth. He would bring a generous armful. He would bring them all. He worked quickly, entirely absorbed, so intent that he failed to notice the approach of footsteps. Only when he stepped back from the now stripped bush, its branches left bare where petals had been moments before, did the unmistakable sensation of being watched prickle along his skin. He turned. A figure towered over him. At first glance it seemed a man. At second, something other. The stranger's face was half hidden under a wild growth of hair, and his frame was unnaturally tall and powerfully built. He wore a wrinkled linen shirt and rough breeches as if he had thrown them on in a hurry and stormed out without a thought for appearances. Fury burned in his eyes. "What do you suppose you are doing?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl that reminded Marcel of a wolf warning intruders from its den. Marcel froze, the heavy bouquet dragging at his left hand. Stammering, he explained that he had believed the estate to be empty, that he had assumed the roses would not be missed at all, and, seeing no softening whatsoever in that fierce expression, he added weakly that he had promised a rose to his daughter, who had longed for one for years. The wild-looking man said nothing at first. He regarded Marcel in a long, measuring silence, as if weighing the worth of every word. Then he drew himself up to his full height. "You entered my home without asking. You ate the supper that had been prepared. You slept by my fire. I allowed all of that to pass without confronting you. But now you have stripped every bloom from my most cherished rosebush. It holds deep personal meaning for me. There is not another like it anywhere, and each of those blossoms is priceless in my eyes. You will compensate me." Hearing this, Marcel felt his heart drop like a stone. He shook his head, defeated. He told the stranger there was nothing he could pay, no coin, no goods, nothing whatsoever. The stern host looked at him coolly. "Then you will work off your debt," he said, with finality that admitted no argument. "I require labor on this estate." Marcel gaped, words tangling on his tongue as he tried to find another solution. "Sir, I have 6 children at home," he protested. "I cannot remain here indefinitely. What will become of them?" The man was unmoved. "Either you remain and work until I consider the debt repaid, or a member of your family comes in your stead," he declared. "Take your flowers. They are of no use to me now. Return to your household and make your arrangements. I will expect you or the one who replaces you within 1 week. If no one appears, I will come to find you." With that, the fearsome figure turned sharply and strode back toward the house without a backward glance. Marcel stood rooted to the spot, watching until the stranger vanished into the chateau's shadowed doorway. There was nothing to do but go home and tell his children exactly what he had done. Somehow, he would put things in order so they could manage without him. Perhaps, once the man's anger had cooled, he would show a measure of sense and mercy and not keep Marcel for very long. With the storm blown through and daylight to guide him, Marcel found his way from the estate road back to the main highway and urged the mare onward toward home. He rode at a steady but unhurried pace, sifting through the heavy news he would soon have to share. The day itself was disarmingly beautiful. Mist drifted away, and the gentle sun of early autumn poured down as if it wished to cheer him in spite of everything. Birds sang with innocent sweetness, as though nothing at all were wrong. Marcel felt none of it. His chest ached with dread for the conversation to come. He reached the cottage late that night. His children rushed to greet him, their energy bright and expectant. They were certain he had brought back the finery they had asked for. Laughing and tugging playfully at the saddlebag straps, they reached inside for shoes with sparkling buckles and velvet caps with elaborate trimmings. Marcel, full of regret, could only place a rose in each outstretched hand. Elodie lifted her flower and breathed in its fragrance with unfeigned delight, admiring every perfect petal. The other 5 were not satisfied whatsoever. They demanded to know where their real gifts were. That evening, gathered tightly around the crowded kitchen table, Marcel told the entire story of his ill-fated journey. How the creditors had taken everything. How the storm had driven him to shelter. How he had eaten by a stranger's fire, how the rosebush had tempted him into breaking his promise of good behavior, and how the owner, fierce as a legend and unwavering as iron, had set the terms for repayment. When he concluded by saying he would have to return and work off his debt, the 5 eldest erupted into complaints. They pouted loudly and asked with great indignation how they were supposed to manage without him. Elodie alone said nothing. She stared at the table unreadable, thinking in a deep, quiet way that no one else in the room seemed capable of. At last she lifted her head and asked for silence. Startled, because Elodie rarely insisted on being heard, her brothers and sisters fell quiet. She announced that she would go to the estate and take her father's place. Marcel's eyes filled at once. He protested that he could never allow such a thing, that under no circumstance whatsoever would he send his youngest into the service of a stranger who had shown himself so severe. But Elodie's reasoning, calm and steady, proved difficult to deny. Father was needed at home, truly needed, to arrange work, to keep the family's modest income alive, to guide the others who were plainly lost without him. She, on the other hand, could be spared. She had learned to keep a household running. She could cook, clean, and attend to tasks with diligence. There is no other sensible solution, she finished gently but firmly. I will be the one to work off what we owe. It took only a day or two for Elodie to prepare the few possessions she would take. As the rose her father had brought began to wilt, she pressed it carefully between the pages of a book. She wanted a reminder, plain and powerful, of why she was leaving the life she knew to serve a fearsome stranger in a remote, isolated house. She was frightened, yes, of course she was, but her determination to make her father proud and to protect her family was stronger than fear. The morning of her departure rose bright and clear. She and Marcel packed her things into a small cart and hitched it to their faithful mare. The chateau would take 2 days to reach at a walking pace with the little cart in tow. Marcel knew an inn where they could sleep on the first night. The older siblings came to the cottage door to see them off, a complicated mix of relief and reluctant admiration on their faces. They were glad they would not be left to manage for long on their own. The road felt solemn beneath their wheels. On the first day, the sky remained fair and the travel was simple. Their night at the inn passed without incident. On the second morning, however, autumn staked its claim upon the forest. The wind rose and worried the branches. The first crisp brown leaves skittered across the path in quick little dances. The mare kept her steady rhythm, drawing them closer and closer to the moment of parting neither father nor daughter wanted to reach. When Marcel recognized the turnoff to the estate, his heart began to break by degrees with every step the horse took. Sensing his spirits falter, Elodie gathered her courage and gave him a reassuring smile. "Do not worry, father," she said in a voice made to soothe. "I am capable. I will be all right." He nodded, hoping her words would prove true. At last they came to the gloomy gate. Marcel pushed it open again, led the mare through, and guided the cart toward the imposing house for the second time. Elodie stared openly. The elaborate but untended gardens and the severe, soaring walls made a scene more grand than anything she had ever imagined. It overwhelmed her, and yet it possessed a kind of stark beauty. Raised in a village with low rooftops and friendly lanes, she felt the mystery and the permanence of this place in her bones. The very stones seemed to sleep with one eye open, as if they had been waiting for a very long time to be noticed again. She wondered what sort of work would be required of her here and prayed it would not be beyond the abilities of the former keeper of a humble cottage. Marcel halted the cart at the foot of the wide front steps. A side wind came suddenly and shoved at them, almost as if the weather itself wished to send them away. He climbed the stairs slowly, lifted the heavy knocker, and let it fall. Father and daughter waited, bracing themselves for the arrival of the house's ferocious master. To their surprise, The door opened not to reveal the towering figure from Marcel's memory, but a boy of perhaps 13. He wore plain village clothes and peered out with frank curiosity. After a brief, thoughtful look, he nodded as though something had been confirmed in his mind. "Is one of you the new helper?" he asked. Marcel blinked at the unexpected question, then explained that he had brought his daughter, Elodie, who would be serving in his place to settle the debt that had been demanded. The boy nodded again, as if this were exactly what he had anticipated, and pulled the door wide, motioning for Elodie to come inside. He told Marcel to leave her trunk in the entry and be on his way. Then he scurried off into the depths of the house, no doubt to announce that the new servant had arrived. With the wind at her back, Elodie crossed the threshold into her new life. The farewell that followed between father and daughter was brief and aching. They both wore brave faces because anything else would have undone them completely. Marcel turned the mare homeward under a weighty sky. He did not look back until they had passed through the gates, and then the trees closed behind him like a curtain. Elodie stood uncertainly in the echoing hall. Gray daylight filtered through the high windows above the door, but it did nothing to warm the vast space. She held herself a little closer to her trunk and reminded her heart that courage must be practiced, not merely imagined. After a few minutes, the boy returned at a run. "The lord of the house says I am to take you to your room," he announced cheerfully. He hoisted the trunk with a practiced grip and started up the broad, curving staircase. Elodie followed, surprised to be going up rather than down to a kitchen or scullery. Perhaps she thought she would be tucked into some attic corner. Instead, the boy, who introduced himself in passing as Rowan, turned down the very first grand corridor. Their quiet steps moved over heavy carpets as they passed portrait after portrait of long-ago nobles. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her, not with malice but with the cool assessment of people who had watched generations come and go. Elodie stared so intently that she nearly walked into Rowan when he stopped at a door and pushed it open. Inside was the most handsomely appointed bedroom she had ever seen. Not enormous, no, and certainly not gaudy, but the canopy bed, the fine fabrics, and the glow of dark, polished wood were deeply luxurious. She noticed a small dressing table and a window seat with cushions that invited a person to curl up and watch the world. Rowan knelt at the hearth, coaxed a fire to life, and rose with a grin once it was crackling. "I help the master here with all sorts of things," he said. "I am glad you have come. It gets very solitary sometimes, and I truly do need help with the daily bits and pieces." Elodie did not yet know what those bits and pieces might be, but she thanked him sincerely for the fire and asked when she would meet her employer. Rowan explained that the Lord had said he would see her in the morning to explain her duties. For now, Rowan would bring a simple supper, and he hoped she would rest well. With that, he slipped out and closed the door so softly it hardly made a sound. Elodie took a steadying breath and began to unpack. She hung her few dresses in the large wardrobe and set her small collection of books on the bedside table. Opening the one on top, she looked at the pink rose pressed between its pages. With a wavering smile, she closed the cover and set it aside. She drew back the heavy curtains and tucked herself into the cushioned window seat. From there she could see the courtyard spread below, the paths bordered by plantings that had grown wild, the stone walls draped in vine. Evening drifted in, and the wind worried leaves and twigs into little spirals. Dark clouds hurried past the rising moon. Exhausted by travel and by so much newness, she dozed for a few minutes, cocooned by the curtains. A soft knock roused her. When she opened the door, a tray waited on the floor. Bread, cheese, a bowl of soup, and a cup of hot tea that breathed steam into the cool air. She glanced up and down the corridor. Rowan had vanished like a shadow. She carried the tray to a small table near the fire and discovered only then how hungry she was. She ate every crumb and drained the cup, then slipped beneath the coverlet without much ceremony at all. The bed held her as if it had been made to fit her, and within a minute, perhaps less, she was asleep. Her dreams were strange. She walked the chateau's dark corridors following a large, silent dog whose paws made no sound whatsoever. The animal slipped into one room, then another, always reappearing a few seconds later as if urging her on. When she reached a certain doorway through which it had just disappeared, she looked in and saw not a dog but the back of a man seated at a desk. He began to turn toward her, and just before she could see his face, she woke. She sat up in the gray-lit room. The fire had dwindled to embers. Daylight pressed gently at the window. As her thoughts settled into wakefulness, a knock sounded. Rowan stood outside with a tray. "Good morning, Miss Elodie," he said with a politeness that felt sincere. "I have brought you a little breakfast." Then, with a motion toward the direction of the front hall, he added, "The master requests that you come to his study when you are finished." Elodie nodded, accepted the tray, and he vanished once more. An hour later she stood, nervous but composed, at the threshold of the very room where her father had found warmth and food on that stormy night. She heard the shuffling of papers within. She gathered a breath, cleared her throat, and knocked softly on the door.